Good evening. Welcome to Freethought Forum. This is a show hosted by the Atheist Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. My name is Riv.
This is Infidel Pharaoh.
And I'm Faithless Forrest, and we want you to know that if you don't believe in God, you're not alone. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free-thinking atheists and agnostics. This is a show for people like them, or for anyone interested in a life free of supernatural beliefs. We don't have any news items today, but in the studio with us is you're the Infidel Pharaoh?
I am.
You're the Infidel Pharaoh, and so today's question is going to be about, we're going to speak about Islam and modernity and
we're basically,
things like that.
Yeah, I wanna address a little bit. Since I underwent a big transformation coming to this country. Coming from Egypt was set of culture and that was conditioned a lot with Islamic.
So let's set the stage. You came to the United States. How old were you at the time?
I was 24.
24. And you came here probably to go to college?
I came here to finish my PhD, yes.
Okay. And at the time, were you still a believer?
I was still a believer, and I was leading the prayer in the mosque here in Knoxville for about a year.
Okay. All righty. But you're here with us today, and you're going to enlighten Rev and I about things in the Middle East to which I have at most a very superficial knowledge. All righty.
Yeah, and the way I think that will be really good is maybe I will start with a little bit of introduction of some of the points that I want to touch on.
Okay.
And then we have like a free discussion.
All right. I may slow you down and make sure that you explain to viewers some of the things we're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
And are you prepared to describe Islam and maybe give us the nickel summary of its history?
Sure. Well, Islam is a religion, one of the three main Abrahamic religions.
Okay.
Their main belief is that Muhammad is the last prophet. He came to basically fix both Christianity and Judaism and bring it back to the true Abrahamic faith.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Islam and Judaism, I would say it's about 90% Orthodox Judaism, and then it divert from Christianity quite a bit, and the main part is the nature of Jesus, whereas Muslim believe he's a prophet. And then, so this is the main position of Islam and the other two Abrahamic religions. So after Muhammad's death, there was what's called Khulafa Rashidin.
What's the time frame on Muhammad's alleged life? Assuming there is
600, around 600.
Yeah.
Assuming that he existed around 600 AD.
Yeah.
And basically after his death, there was four what's called Khulafa Rashidin, and those are the followers of Muhammad, and basically those were a continuation for Muhammad rule. Say, and this was the beginning of the Islamic.
You say there were four. Now,
there was four, yes.
I think there's another thing that should be emphasized, and that is that there was a succession fight.
There was,
Yes.
and this is where the big fight between actually Shia and Muslim and Sunni started, which is Shia believes that Ali ibn Abi Talib, which was fourth Khalifa after Muhammad, was actually that the message was actually passed to him. That was actually he was a successor to Muhammad, whereas Sunnis do not believe there was a successor to Muhammad as a prophet. So this is the biggest.
And would Sunnis have then had as their caliph, I guess something? It's like a nephew of Muhammad.
Ali ibn Abi Talib was his nephew.
Okay.
and this is basically the Shia successor, what they believe his actual successor to Muhammad.
Okay.
And they believe that he's also so Muhammad has what's called the isma, which means he can never do anything wrong. He's basically he can
Infallible, I guess.
yeah. And Shia believe that Ali ibn Abi Talib have this ability to, whereas Sunnis do not believe this. And then there is a lot, there is some more major differences between them.
All right, these are all things that are new to me, and I'm sure are new to a lot of viewers.
If I can ask two things jump out that
Sure.
come often in conversation, as I know a precious little about myself. What is the significance of the angel Gabriel, and why is it so you cannot do anything to draw a picture, to represent Muhammad in any kind of way? What are those?
So Gabriel is actually he's a messenger of God. He's basically what brought. So Muhammad used to get the message and the verses from Quran in a cave called Ghar Hira, which cave of Hira. And basically, Gabriel was the messenger that basically communicated with Muhammad, between Muhammad and God. So in Islamic belief, the only person that communicated directly to God was Moses. And then, other than that, all prophets were communicated through Gabriel.
So he's I can't help but think Gabriel's the secretary then. The CEO, he's not seen directly.
Yes, in Islam, it's actually, his name is the Holy Spirit, which you can also, you can think about as the Holy Ghost, how it morphed into the whole Holy Ghost from Christianity.
Yeah, because there were definitely different connotations.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
The Holy Ghost being as pick a flavor, but I've heard some interpretations of it being the guiding force of wisdom and justice, and will let the Holy Ghost guide you, and in all kinds of ways it'll be represented. Whereas if you go back to at least on the Christianity side, if you go back to the original Council of Nicaea, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have kind of a division of what is what, and no one agrees on anything. So everyone constantly pulled them all together and said, "We're not leaving until we have some agreement on is there a Holy Trinity or is there not?" And then so the Holy Ghost can have different connotations,
Yeah.
But different thing.
Right. So one of the main beliefs in Islam, and this is a point that I really would come to at the end, and it's a very important point, that Quran is not like the Bible. It's not a narrative that was written by humans. That actually Quran existed as is in heaven in the beginning of days, and basically it was transformed to Muhammad. So Quran is written. You can think about it as it's written by God. So there is no way that anything in Quran can be wrong. So Muslims believe that Quran is 100% correct, and it's protected through history from any modifications.
So it is truly the living word.
Correct, exactly. And
I would have said the opposite. To say living implies
that actually changes.
Yeah.
Lived
It
word.
would be the immutable. Immutable.
Which is really interesting, because the way, if you look at the history number one, there is no history about Muhammad or any of this Islamic history outside of the Islamic history books or Islamic scholars. I'm not going to get into this today, but that's the whole point, actually, that there is actually some recent research that even the early Muslims were actually Christians, and they wanted to divide themselves from the existing empire. So that's when they created this whole history. But I'm not going to into this today. But the point I was trying to get to by talking about the Quran was that basically they believe that it is a true word of God and it can never change. So that's a difference between it and Bible, which is again is really interesting, because if you look at the history of how Quran was collected from the Islamic history itself. So during the days that Muhammad, when it came to Muhammad, there was no writing. So it was basically transformed between another person. So Muhammad came, he took it in the cave, and then he went and he basically read it to his followers, and then every follower memorized a piece, and then after Muhammad's death, then there was sort of like, okay, now all those people that memorize Quran are soon gonna die, so now let's collect it. So Quran in its current form is divided into what's called surahs, which is big chapters, and then inside it there is what's called ayat, which is just small verses. So when they start collecting Quran, actually, it didn't come to Muhammad in the same order that it is in the book right now. So when they started collecting it, they start basically building this. On top of that, during the time they collected the Quran, the Arabic alphabet was not in its current form. So Arabic alphabets comes from Aramaic. It's its main.
Okay.
It is its successor, basically. Predecessor. And at this time, when they started collecting Quran, there wasn't the punctuations on the letters, and the letters of the Arabic itself was not in its current form, because there is what's called I don't know what's the literal translation for it, but there is symbols that you put on top of each letter or in the bottom of it that can completely change the sound of this letter.
Okay.
So imagine you have a book that was written with these blank letters, and later when the language matured, they start putting all those like punctuations and everything to come to its current form.
And in other words, whoever decided to put some of this punctuation was making a decision about pronunciation.
Pronunciation and meaning even.
And therefore meaning without any reference from the original.
Correct.
It would be. I could have sworn I had a nice example of. Oh yeah. So there was a knock on my door a month or so ago, and it was some Jehovah's Witnesses, and I used the word Yahweh, and they wanted to use the word Jehovah, and I said, well, I'm of the opinion that Jehovah is an early and erroneous attempt by German scholars in the 1800s to find a way to vocalize what is also called the Tetragrammaton. And isn't it easier to say? I think I made a joke to the effect that, well, do we want to say Tetragrammaton?
What's Tetragrammaton?
It's like the 4 Hebrew characters that make Yahweh or Jehovah, but there are no vowels.
Okay.
That's why there's only 4 of them. And so the vowels are still speculative. So whoever decides to put those vowels in is now determining the sound of Yahweh or Jehovah or... So same kind of problem happened with the Hebrew language, the ambiguity in pronunciation and therefore potentially even meaning.
So Quran is the main building block of Islam, and then on top of the Quran there is what's called Hadith, and Hadith, it's basically the saying of Muhammad that was translated or was memorized by his followers to basically build what's called Sharia, which is basically the how Muhammad acted and how do you address day-to-day problems or aspects. So you can think about it.
Would it be fair to describe that then as a code of moral conduct?
It is. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. That's what it is. And then there is main scholars that wrote those hadith. One of them is called Bukhari, and this is like one of the big Islamic books. They have validation for them, and they build the whole...
They have what for them?
Validation. They have they rank them based on the validation, if it's actually a valid saying or not. But there is... and then on top of this, there is another building block, which is... there is what's called A'imma in Islam, which is the people of knowledge. which is basically they take the Quran and the Hadith, and then they actually translate it to the common people, and and actually build the Sharia. So there is 4 A'imma.
So you said the word translate, and isn't that really because the Arabic of Muhammad's time is no longer the spoken Arabic? In a sense, it's kind of archaic?
No, it's not. Sorry, translate is not the right word. It's basically to
Interpret.
explain it. Because Quran is it's actually very general, except for some specific incidents and some stories. And then those A'imma, they basically think about them as philosophers of the religion. So they come up with these hypothetical situations, and then it's like, okay, how would Islam solve this? And then they build this basic manifesto of like, okay, this is how we deal with these situations based on Quran and the Hadith.
If something comes to mind, it's often said that in order to understand, when people go looking for answers and try to say, well, you didn't read the original version, that changes everything. Would that fall into the sense of Islam is of the basically reading before and the after, or is there any validity to that in regards to what the golden age of Islam was? A couple hundred years, we had scientific breakthroughs and everything.
Mm-hmm. So actually, during the scientific breakthroughs, during this period, that's the period when Muslims start translating a lot of books from Greek philosophers and some of the ancient books from the Greek time, and then you have Ibn Rushd and all this Islamic scholars that came up, with this more of lightened new additions to the even recent times, and also at the same time when you have what's called Sufis start rising, which Sufis are, you can think about them as Gnostic Muslims. They are basically people that translated off of Greek philosophy, and then they took Islam and projected in this sense. So they really and this is how I was raised basically as a Sufi. So they don't believe much in literal translation of Quran, and everything is more about, they approach it more from a philosophical aspect or sense. When
you say philosophical, I don't know enough about, let's say, the non-philosophical approach to know how that would be applied. How would it possibly be different?
So let's take an example. So an example is let's take one of the jihad verses, which is basically the verses that talks about fighting in Islam. So there is a bunch of verses in Quran that talks about fighting, non-Muslims and fighting others. So, for example, Sufis, when they look at this, they project it as basically it's not a literal story that happened, but it is basically describes a battle between, they have this evil character and the self, and you have this fight between the self and the evil inside of you. So that's an example of...
meaning they reinterpret it as an internal struggle.
As an internal struggle. Which is interesting because, so when I was being raised in this, it made sense to me because really I was like, but when I went back, when I left everything and I started looking at it, and then I saw how this interpretation really contradicts with a lot of, it's, you can think about more of as an apologetic version of Muslims. If everything is up to interpretation as a story that just to explain something that really didn't happen, then the whole book doesn't make sense, because then it's up for interpretation for anything. I can just take the story and can make whatever I want out of it, when there is no meaning of it being a cornerstone as a Sharia for Islam. Does this make sense?
Okay. I'm learning lots here.
Yeah, this is several times more than I was aware, especially the part about the. I didn't know it was thought to be the immutable word. That's
that's new to me as well.
Yeah.
Meaning, the detail you described as well, it existed in heaven and then was relayed. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, at least, I mean, again, from the kind of the analogy, at least from the Christian perspective of it, was at least then there is acknowledgement of, well, it was inspired and men wrote it, and we're not sure about the books and everything, but coming from the Quran, it's kind of a priori, and then it just comes down.
And that's it, exactly. So when anything that comes directly from Quran, there is no question about it.
And that explains why Arabic is the language of heaven then.
Yes.
Because it was written there. All right. Yeah. What a wonderful coincidence.
And Aramaic, right, informed a lot of the other systems in counting and language, and goes up and goes out into Europe and expanded and so on and so on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, very fascinating.
Okay, go ahead.
I was going to say, do you have more points for us here?
Oh, well, this is just the intro. Yeah, I was going to try to get into the main points.
Oh, all right. By all means, we're about halfway through. Viewers, if you'd like to call in and ask questions, that's good too. The number is on the screen in front of, between Rudolph and Santa here. And we'll be trying to watch for the little light that tells us you're calling. Don't give up.
All right. So I really like the main points I wanted to get to today was more of like, can Islam in its current form exist in humanitarian societies? Can it exist in a secular society? Does it, in its current form, basically contradicts with the current Western secular principles? So I wanted to focus on some points, and that is, like some of the main points I think that can relate us, and we can see how far it goes.
Alrighty. As you go on, I'm going to want to, as you make each point, I'm going to want to challenge you how you came to that point, and in a sense on what authority, because you can't know all the versions of Islam that are out there, for instance. So try to give us a sense of the reason behind your claim, and how widespread that belief might be.
Sure.
Where it might not be universal, let's say.
Okay. All right. Well, so basically the first point I wanted to highlight is there's some rules in Islam that exist if you are in an Islamic country, and there is rules that does not exist if you are not an Islamic country. And the way that they classify a country as Islamic or not is the majority of the people living there. So one of the major rules that I wanted to discuss today is basically the rule of non-Muslims to Muslims in an Islamic country, which means if you are an Islamic country, can a non-Muslim be a ruler to you? And that's, in Islam, this is actually not allowed.
So that must make a problem in Lebanon, because Lebanon, I think its current constitution was set up when it was a majority Christian nation, and it has become majority Muslim, and yet it's got institutions that I think guaranteed representation for Christians, Muslims, and I think another faith group that, do you know? I think there were three somehow.
I think it's mainly
it may be
mainly Christians and Muslims.
Maybe Hebrews, maybe.
Maybe, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But yes, this is a case for Lebanon, because the majority then, was not Muslims. But for example, like I will give you an example, is in Egypt, very recent, after the whole Arab Spring, and when they knocked down the old constitution, then they basically wanted to make sure that there is a passage inserted in there that the Islamic Sharia is the main source of law in the nation, which is also another point, because under Islam, issues like marriage, issues like heritage, all this, there is rules about it in Islam. So basically, if you are in a country where you have majority and you apply to the rules of Islam, then you basically follow the Islamic rules for marriage and heritage. And rules for marriage, it's mainly for the divorce, and then marriage between a Muslim and non-Muslim. And for heritage, it's basically the division of the equality of the heritage, since a guy get doubles a female.
Say that again, slower.
Like a guy get twice the woman in Islamic.
Meaning if you're an estate is being divided, the daughters get a third and the son gets 2/3 if there was one daughter, one son. Okay.
I think this is significant because it's not as though, say, in other countries where a religion is more predominant in different parts, you're saying this was baked into the founding going forward.
Correct.
Which is, it is a true theocracy in every sense of the word.
It is, and I think that the biggest difference is.
I see a light blinking. We don't have a screener. I'll do the button. Hello, caller. You've reached Freethought Forum TV. We don't have a screener today. Can you give us a name or a nickname, please?
It's Charles from Central Illinois.
All right, Charles. Thank you for calling us today. And do you have a comment or a question for the infidel Pharaoh here?
Yes. Regarding to the writing of the Quran itself, I understand that the oldest known version of the Quran is in an Afghan museum, written supposedly sometime around 700. Now that's what I've heard, but I cannot demonstrate.
Yes, so the oldest version of Quran that exists, I believe it's called the Uthman Quran, which was a version that was written during the Khalifa called Uthman. And I'm not sure, I don't remember exact date when it was written, but I believe it was, they claim it's around the mid-700s.
So that could still be 100 years after Muhammad's death?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm also given to understand that some of the Arabic symbology is somewhat different from later versions of the Quran, changing the meanings of the word.
Yes.
So that how do people deal with that discrepancy?
Yeah. So the way they deal with the discrepancy is they basically say that God protected the Quran, and it's goes back. Yeah, it goes back to the. This is why I started by saying they believe it was written this way and it's always protected. So this is their way of addressing, this. Whereas there is actually right now, there is actually verses of there is different versions of Quran that were found that has completely different verses from what exists right now, with different letters.
So where would this find have occurred?
I believe it was actually. Let's see. I have it here. Actually, I might even be able to show you a picture of it.
All right. Imam's book here's got a lot of what looks like papyruses in it.
Yes.
And it's because papyruses get preserved in a dry climate.
Yes. So this is actually, let's see. Yeah. So this is, I don't know if you'll be able to see this.
Well, turn it around, and so it's a papyrus, and it looks like the center portion of it is missing. I assume it was folded, and
Correct.
and an edge maybe got eaten away by insects or rotted
Yes,
due to some moisture reaching it.
Yeah. So this is basically like one of the books that was found actually in Egypt, and there was a big verses that had discrepancy between it and the current existing approved.
Does your book explain the differences of the verse? Can you find that without delaying the viewers too long?
I don't have it highlighted here, but I can actually highlight it and give you guys.
Well, you look for that. I'll mention something else. In Egypt, the climate is such that things can get preserved, and really old Christian documents, as a result, get preserved there. And one of the more fascinating things I read was a book by Bart Ehrman, I think is his name. It's called The Gospel of Judas, and it's one of these things that turned up in Egypt. It's a document that was deemed to be heretical and therefore ordered to be destroyed in all instances by the standard, or what became the dominant Christian tradition.
The Orthodox tradition before the split with the East and West between Roman Catholicism and Orthodoxy.
Yeah, and
Now,
it was
go
on.
The same thing with the Gospel of Thomas, even though it's been quoted in the Channel Textures of St. Paul.
Yeah, so there's something, I think it might be pronounced something like Nag Hammadi. It's a cache, which is to say, I think, an underground burial of documents. I think they were in clay vessels.
The Nag Hammadi Library.
There we go. And I think Gospel of Thomas was found in there.
I think about Nag Hammadi, right? That's what it is.
Yeah, well, I'm sure I'm mangling it because I speak Minnesotan. But similar thing, because of the environment, it gets preserved, and if it weren't for that, we wouldn't know many things about the past. But the thing that these documents show is that there were very different versions of Christianity going around in the first and the second and the third centuries.
So apparently something similar happened in the earlier era of Islam's history after the death of Muhammad, and they began to try to figure out what they do next, because Muhammad never really led any instructions on what was to happen.
Correct. Yep. That's a time during the four Khalifas I was mentioning earlier, and that's a time where there was a lot of wars happened, and then it ended up was what's called the biggest fitna in Islam, or the biggest war, which is basically between those that were supporting Ali ibn Abi Talib, which is Muhammad's nephew, and his sons Hassan and Hussein, and basically the Sunnis, which was led by Muawiyah.
And, well, I guess what we were trying to get at is, was there a particular case of some verses that had differed?
Yes.
You didn't find them?
Yeah. So I was actually explaining here. I was looking at this guy, and it's identifying some of the problems, which is.
Well, you look. I'll try and cover for the prevent dead air by saying, in the case of Christianity, the Gnostic Gospels talk about a very different view of what the deity is, And in particular, the creator God of the Hebrew Bible is not the creator of the universe. He's kind of like a one level down God, and the act of creating the earth as we know it was actually kind of like a bad thing, or we could either say it's a mistake or evil. And the whole idea that they're presenting is that Jesus is teaching people how to escape that in death and escape the evil of the Hebrew God's creation. It's a unexpectedly different worldview.
Somebody in the first century after the supposed crucifixion came up with that concept, and it was a response to the concept inside Justinian, or however it's pronounced, starts with a Z, how there was a one supreme absolute being, and the reason why everything is wrong is because one of his very first aspects or creations tried to do a one-man up on him. This was sometimes known as the peacock angel, or the peacock angel's evil brother.
On a kind of small point of levity in all this, it reminds me of Lord of the Rings, and how essentially you had what was this? The supreme, the highest.
In the Silmarillion, the deity is Iluvatar, which is a beautiful word Tolkien made up, and Tolkien.
Right. So what he's doing is he's orchestrating. It's so lovely. He's orchestrating a symphony. And all this music is going out, but there's this contrarian individual who is making dissonance, and every single time, Morgoth. There's three instances of waves of dissonance, and every single time, Iluvatar becomes not so much agitated, so much as maybe less tolerant to the disruption.
He calls the choir to a halt,
right.
Has them start again. Morgoth tries to innovate, and that creates confusion.
Right, and then at the end of it, once the final time, Iluvatar says, "It is done. We're going to stop this. We're going to stop all the singing. No more singing." But at the end, basically, Iluvatar still wins the game because you find out that, we'll see, through your destruction, I made creation. And then you have the aspects of reality of the earth, and it just kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, I've actually very much admired Tolkien's literary creation story there. I think it's better than any of the extant religion's creation story, because it's at least told in a more artful manner. Were you able to find
Yeah, so this is actually...
the Infidel Pharaoh has center stage here.
So this is... I don't know if you'd be able to see that.
You just read them for us, and please translate, of course.
Ooh. Okay, so so this is a papyrus that was actually found in Cairo, and this is one word. For example, Yaltaqiyan, which in its current form in the current Quran is Yaltaqiyan, which has a letter called Te, which is this. Can they see that?
Pointing at the camera. That we needed a felt tip, but
anyway. So basically,
it looks like a right angle with two dots.
With two dots.
All right.
Yeah. So if you remove those two dots,
so we've just got a right angle,
and you put the dot in the bottom.
Oh my goodness!
That's a completely different. That's a completely different letter. So this word Yaltaqiyan was basically in this papyrus was found without the dot on the Te, which these guys. So it's read instead of Yaltaqiyan, which means merging, it translates into Yalqiyan, which is throw.
Okay, they aren't even close.
No, but that's an example.
Well, what is the rest of the sentence though about? Are we merging? Are we throwing corporations or?
No, so it's basically like it talks about basically waves.
As in waves on the ocean?
Yep. So basically, in the context of this verse, it's basically ربكما مرج البحرين يلتقيان, which is meaning that God merged the two seas together.
Okay.
And then has the word يلتقيان, which is basically like meeting. So in this sentence, it does make sense that it is a word with two dots.
Okay. And is that the older form or the newer form?
The older form is the one without the dots,
Oh.
because the papyrus is predated.
Okay. But there it means to throw,
To throw, yes.
which is kind of, and if I remember what the sentence you said, God was throwing, and that made everything together,
Yeah.
which does seem to kind of be a
Yeah.
mess.
So there is other. He's just showing other example, like which is other words that doesn't have the dots.
All right.
Because this is the main confusion basically between those and what changes the meaning of these words. So this is just an example of this.
All right.
Now, another point to the grist of the show: can Islam survive into the future? If it does, it's going to have to do what the Roman Catholic Church do and accept that the universe is what it is instead of what the ancient fables said it was. For instance, the primary problem for a long time for the Roman Catholic Church about evolution is because it removes the concept of original sin. But now they just sidestep the whole issue and says, no, it really doesn't matter. We're all still marked with the original sin, and that the Adam and Eve story is pretty much basically a metaphor for our sinful nature.
It's interesting how, well, I say interesting in maybe morbid sense perhaps, but hopefully not. But regardless, more and more would be interpreted as and thought of, well, okay, we can no longer reconcile this, so we have to find a way to explain it away as to make sense with the shifting tides of what society will accept and will it not accept. And so when you have something so strict and unchanging, such as the Quran is stated to be, I think he faces a lot of challenges in a much more uphill battle than
It is, and it's not just that. It's actually the amount of scholarly around the Quran, which is produce what's the Sharia, which is basically it's about 600. There is about 600,000 books in the Islamic libraries. That's one of the numbers I found. So start like, for example, throwing away some of these verses, or acknowledging that some of it doesn't even works in our current days, but they don't want to do that, So yes, it will be an uphill battle for sure.
They're very much like in some regards to the Christian Scientists and the other extremists in Christianity that refuse to go to medical doctors because it's not biblically correct.
Correct.
And unfortunately, where Islam is the predominant religious belief, a lot of the ruling classes, or the dominant ruling people, have so much invested in it that they're willing to go to extreme violent measures to keep that the way it is.
Absolutely, and it's one of the ways of controlling the mass. Like, for example, now in Egypt, one of the there's quite a bit of a rise in the atheist movement, but the government is cracking down on them, and the reason they are cracking down on them because of the Azhar mosque. That is basically the Azhar is one of the major scholarly mosques in the, for Muslims. That's where they go and study all the Islamic Sharia and all the stuff, and they basically have a big say about what happens, and they will be basically opposing any sort of modernization and even reinterpretation of some of the things.
So, in Europe, over centuries, we had this thing called the Renaissance, the rebirth, the rebirth of knowledge and learning, where they, I think, in a sense, layer upon layer of re-explaining what the Bible might mean so as to reconcile it with discoveries about how the world really works. And the principal example of which, well known, is the Copernican Revolution that argued that the Earth goes around the sun, and the observations made in the 1600s with telescopes by Galileo that really proved that that's the case. So, because it was kind of gradual, maybe what I'm trying to contrast and say, it sounds like you're saying that Islam is going to be, in a sense, more brittle. That because it's claimed to be this thing written in heaven, that if you can chip away one piece of it and say, well, that piece wasn't, then the whole thing looks like it's ready to topple.
That's right.
So does that mean that that people in the Islamic world consider other worldviews, that they're more likely to then maybe go to non-belief than to merely moderate Islam?
I believe so. And that is what we're seeing right now as a rise of the numbers. The latest number I was looking at, there is about 3 to 4 million atheists in Egypt, which is a
out
big
of a
number.
population of what?
Of about 100 million.
Okay, well, all right, we're still then talking
Yeah, but
4% or 5%.
That's significantly larger than it was a century ago.
it is.
Okay, all right.
So what's your...
Uh,
Go ahead.
It's approximating that of declared atheists in the United States.
Okay, and one final question for Infidel Fola. What is Islamic's view on this Mike Hughes trying to prove the Earth is flat with his steam-powered rocket?
Yeah.
Heard of that?
Yeah. Well, he's actually delayed his rocket launch, I guess. It's true about this lunatic in California that was trying to launch a...
I saw something. I didn't know about steam powered, but does he shovel coal into the boiler?
I think he's using hydrogen peroxide and rocks or something.
All right.
High quality materials.
Well, there is nothing that talks about the whole flat Earth thing, and I think it's just...
Is there any echoes of the creation story in the Quran?
Absolutely, and this is one of the things, because he was just mentioning, the Christians are moving away from it. But in Islam, Adam and Eve is essential, because that's basically describe the whole creation of. There is no sin, there is no original sins in Islam, but basically how we got into the earth, basically, which is the whole thing. Like they were in heaven and the forbidden fruit, and basically they were kicked out and to earth. So it's the same story, and then Eve was basically created from Adam rib. So
Which is the Hebrew story.
Yeah, exactly.
It's how come Allah, the God, which is what the word Allah means, didn't take it out on Istis instead of taking it out on the people of Istis trick.
I didn't hear that, Charles. Did you understand him? Just please say that again more clearly, Charles.
Well, how come Allah didn't take it out on the one that tricked Adam and Eve instead of taking it out on Adam and Eve?
Okay.
It's like my question is for the Christians on this.
Well, yeah, the difference is actually in Islam, Eve is the one who tricked Adam.
I think Charles' point is different. There's the serpent. The serpent is the one who talked Eve into eating the apple.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, but Charles, the serpent was punished. He was supposed to go around on his belly.
The rest of his days. That's so harsh.
Oh, he's been around
Yeah.
for a long time.
All right.
Okay.
This
I'll let you go in case you get another caller.
Thanks much. And we'll talk to you another time. Viewers, we got just a little less than 4 minutes. If you want to call, it's got to be quick. Have a good, sharp, pointed question for the infidel Pharaoh. He's not here with us very often.
I'll say really quick, this reminds me, and it kind of makes a lot more sense in light of the context of everything. There's many debates with Ra versus, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Sabor Ahmad? Sabor Ahmad?
Oh, Sabur Ahmad, yeah.
But, the thing is, Ra is coming from a perspective of evolution as we understand it. He's very much an expert in the field. And where Sabor holds so steadfast to, it kind of reminds me of what you're talking about, this cannot be wrong. Because if this wrong, everything is wrong. It just kind of highlights that. And going through a lot of, I mentioned hermeneuticals earlier, going through all these cognitive backflips to just try to say, okay, I see what you're saying. However, one word of the sentence is wrong, and therefore everything you're saying is evolution can't possibly be true. Oh. Because it relies on the pillar. It relies on the pillar that the word is true, and that context makes a lot more sense now, rather than just rather than modulating and saying, oh, that makes sense. It's no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
We're going to need to wrap up pretty quick, but I realize we forgot to do the mid-program break, and I want to talk about some of the upcoming events for the Rationalists of East Tennessee briefly. On December 3rd, that's this next Sunday, at the Pellissippi Technical Community College Goins Cafeteria Annex Building will be a program, When is it Wrong to be an Atheist? Christian Persecution Complex, and Is the Bible Relevant Today? Then on December 10th will be the Skeptics Book Club at Books A Million. The book is A Framework for Understanding Poverty by Reuben Payne. The third Sunday of December, the subject is The Best Prescription for U.S. Healthcare Reform. And I guess this is a live presentation by Dr. James Reynolds, M.D. Well, we'll give you about 30 seconds to do your sum up, and then we got to do the farewell. Which points? Is there something you wanted to make sure you said today that you haven't gotten to?
Well, yeah, I guess there's...
We'll be on the show.
Part two.
But, I mean, at least today we got, a good introduction, and that we can have, but as our caller was saying, there need to be a main reformation in Islam if it doesn't want to come into direct conflict with our current or modern days values. So
that makes me think that in a future show we're going to have to define and talk about what even the Reformation meant in Europe. So we're running out of time. This has been Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Shows are most Tuesdays from 5 to 6 p.m.
Meeting up with the Flats and Taps right
There
now.
we go.
Yeah.
I'm glad I have a co-host here. The Flats and Taps is just a little bit east of Westtown Mall. You're welcome to come and join us this evening. We'll talk about this subject or other things. What else is in our normal closing?
Well, blank.
Just remember that if you don't believe in God, the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee is a place where you can find friends. You need not be a